What's that? It's working. Okay. Shabbat Shalom, Gemar Chatima Tova. I meant Chag Sameach. Sorry. Brain is a little bit on autopilot there. It's you get used to saying one thing and then suddenly you get another holiday. It's just the way that the month of Tishrei is. Thankfully, at least, we get the same Torah reading today and tomorrow. So there's a little bit of a break from having to acquire new material. But I want to see how well you were paying attention to the material, and if you're not doing so well, don't worry, you get to do it again tomorrow. It's the review day. What prayers do we say only when there is a minyan? The Kaddish, Baruch Hu, the Amidah with Kiddusha, right? It's not just the Amidah, it's specifically the Kiddusha cannot be said without a minyan. The 13 attributes, no, you can technically say that on your own, although that's actually doing it as a Shabbat service or in other services is a relatively modern invention in Judaism from the 1500s or 16th century with Isaac Luria. The Torah reading, all right, and that's pretty much it, right? The various forms of Kaddish, the Kiddusha, the Baruch Hu, and the public Torah reading are pretty much what requires the minyan. Why? Why do we require a minyan for these things? It's a community activity. What? And like everything else we do isn't? I mean, let's face it, Jews are communal people. We like being with each other. It's just part of it. Even if we complain about each other, we like being with each other. Where does it say this is a communal activity? What is it about this essence of the activity that makes it communal as opposed to the other activities which are not as communal? After all, everything else technically you can do on your own, even without the live stream. Please don't turn off. You don't need a minyan for the other things, but these we do. Just calling them communal is not enough. However, if you were paying attention to today's Torah reading, chapter 22, Leviticus, verse 32, what do we find out? I can wait all day. What's that? That's what chapter 22, verse 32 says? You will be sanctified by my children of Israel. All right, it's a great phrase. Missing, of course, the important Hebrew preposition betoch b'nei Yisrael. Right? V'nigdashti betoch b'nei Yisrael. And I will be sanctified among the children of Israel. So when is it that we need to have a minyan? When we are sanctifying God. When we are proclaiming God's holiness. This is when you need to have a minyan. For everything else that you are doing is not necessarily would be considered a public sanctification, and therefore you don't have to be bitoch among the children of Israel. Now, why 10 became eventually the minyan is a whole nother sermon, but that the sanctifications of God's name requires a minyan is a very powerful concept. On the one hand, it tells us that to truly understand and to proclaim, to make known to others that God is holy and the nature of God's holiness cannot be done as a private activity. The image of a lone monk at the top of a hill chanting quietly to him or herself in order to be in commune with God's holiness is not a Jewish image. The Jewish image is of us all together saying Kadosh, 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 right? Proclaiming God's holiness during the Amidah, or Yit Kadal v'Yit Kadash, proclaiming God's greatness and God's holiness in the Kaddish, or proclaiming God's holiness through the revelation of the Torah, or proclaiming God's holiness that all should come to be connected to the source of all blessing during the Baruch Hu. That is the Jewish concept. But, like many languages, Kiddush HaShem, this sanctification of God's holy name, has another meaning as well. Because why not make the same words do two jobs? So Kiddush HaShem can mean the sanctification of God's name in this particular prayer sort of way. But what else can Kiddush HaShem mean? We used it extensively during the high holidays, in particular during Avinu Malkeinu. And there it was not talking about those who lead services for the proclamation of God's holiness. Jewish terminology, advanced course. Kiddush HaShem, people who die for God, right? What you might call a martyr. Somebody who died rather than give up their Judaism. Somebody who died in order to remain Jewish despite the obstacles, persecutions, and other things that were done against them is considered Kiddush HaShem. I should also point out, although it's not the focus of our discussion today, that all of the authorities point out that living in a way that brings praise to God's name is also Kiddush HaShem, the sanctification of God's name. That when you act in a way that people say, wow, that guy's great, he's Jewish and following God, God must be great too. Anytime you can make that happen, you are also sanctifying God's name in a way that is as powerful as martyring yourself for God's name. When do we martyr ourselves? Because as you probably guessed, martyring is not exactly a Jewish hobby. It is not a focus of our faith. But there are occasions where martyring is what our tradition says, this is what you should do. All right. If, God forbid, someone comes up to you, let's imagine you're at work one day, and your boss comes up to you, and he has a loaded gun in his hand, and he says, we need to let someone go from this company. Either you shoot him, or I shoot you, because we're downsizing. Do you shoot the other guy? Not according to Jewish law, you don't shoot the other guy. Right? Because what? Is your blood redder than his? Are you more sacred than him? Now, I should point out that Jewish law also says that if you do happen to shoot the other guy and then the Jewish authorities arrest you, they cannot actually prosecute you for murder because you were being forced to do it. However, when you stand before the throne of God, there may be a much longer conversation. All right, so murder. Better to die for God's sacred name than it is to commit murder on another person. What else? Idolatry. Your boss comes up to you again at work and says, all right, we're instituting a new policy. We have just installed a large statue of Zeus, and from now on at the beginning of work, we are all going to meet in the large assembly room, and we will be bowing down, praising Zeus, and proclaiming our loyalty to the God of gods, and anyone who doesn't will be killed. This is a pretty strict workplace. We don't bow down. Right? This is a person who is deliberately trying to erase Judaism as well as any other faith in this particular scenario. And better not to work there, but better not to give ourselves up to idolatry than it is to do so. Better to die. Now, again, if somebody chooses to go, oh yeah, Zeus, I love you, and then run, we don't hold it against them the same way as if they had done it voluntarily, because we understand this is under compulsion. And indeed, this became extremely important during different eras in our history when forced conversions were all the rage among those who were around us. And many times people would choose to pretend to convert and then look for the exit as quickly as they could to greater or lesser success. Case in point, see the Spanish Inquisition, which trapped many people, often called the Anusim, those who were forced into these conversions, into conversions that lasted hundreds of years. That was unusual at the time, so they didn't quite expect it to last so long. Usually the dictators get tired of their religious fancies. And there is one more category as well, that it is better to martyr yourself than to commit. Adultery. Well, basically, with anyone you're not allowed to, right? When your boss at the work says, by the way, next week is bring your child to work day, and you will engage in intimate relations with your child, You say, oh no, I won't. And if they say, if you don't, you'll die, you die. Same as they say, next week is going to be bring your spouse to work day, and we are going to swap, and everyone's going to commit adultery. Yeah, this one sounds like maybe the workplace that you're actually a little bit more interested in. I mean, forget the whole murder each other thing, but, what a swing-in place to work. No, Judaism says, no, you do not. All right? What does this company make? What is its product? It makes thumbtacks. So this, we also say, no. If the only option is to choose between incest, adultery, and death, I'm taking death. Again, if you happen to engage, the law says that the earthly court has no power over you because of the compulsion, because of the threat of death that was forcing you to do it. On the other hand, if the boss comes in and says, by the way, today everybody will be required to eat 3 strips of bacon before they can leave, and if they refuse to eat the bacon, we will shoot you. What do? You eat the bacon. And you get out of there. Right? You eat the bacon and you leave. That's just very simple calculations. There is no other commandment that we are required to give up our life for rather than to transgress, except for those 3 that I've already mentioned. Except in an especially difficult setting. If the boss of your company says, oh, Mr. Cohen, we here at Thumbtack Incorporated are going to show the world that Judaism is false and that all Jews are ready to give it up and embrace good old Zeus. But don't worry, I'm not going to make you bow down to Zeus. That would be a step too far, too fast. Instead, we are going to have a large assembly, and all of the employees, especially all the other Jewish ones who work here, are going to watch you as the example employee stand up on the stage and eat these 3 strips of bacon as I proclaim that thus ends Judaism. And if you think this is funny, this has actually happened in our history. Not in Thumbtack Incorporated, but there have actually been different despots at different times that have forced our people to publicly do this. In fact, one of the stories you probably all know very, very well began with exactly this type of situation, the story of Hanukkah. Right? It was when Matthew was being forced to eat pork publicly, or being told he should eat the pork publicly, and when he refused and someone else was willing to, that the rebellion began. So this is not a hypothetical, although the corporate setting certainly is. It's just most people tend to be afraid of their job more than they are of the government these days. So I wanted to make sure we had something somewhat believable. But in this situation, where whoever it is that wields power of life and death over you is telling you that they're asking you to violate the commandment not just on a whim, but specifically as an example of renunciation in public, what do you do? Or what should you do, I should say. What do you do will depend on a great many factors, and as I say, ultimately the earthly court has no power over you. But what does our tradition say you should do in a situation like this? You don't eat the bacon. You don't eat the bacon. If that's the choice you're being given, even for a so-called trivial commandment, not one of the big 3, of murder, idolatry, and sexual immorality, if it's being done specifically to showcase the destruction of Judaism and the renunciation of God, you take the bullet. Because that is the destruction of who we are. That is the destruction of our being, of our essence. And to destroy that is to destroy everything. What would be the point of continuing if those were the conditions under which you would be forced to live? Now, in practice, this is, like I said, much more complicated than simply don't eat the bacon and let them kill you. Obviously, whole communities have had to undergo situations like this, and many people have had to navigate it in many different ways. As I've mentioned before to those who have joined us in Yom Kippur in the past, one of the reasons why we have a specific clause before Kol Nidre, which reminds us that we are praying among those who are righteous and those who are not, is precisely because we know that many people were forced to go through situations like this, and we still welcome them back into the community on Yom Kippur so that they could reconnect despite what choices they may have made under these horrible life and death situations. But we still choose to take the bullet, at least hypothetically, in that kind of situation. So now, how do we reconcile the Kiddush HaShem of the sanctification of God's name and the Kiddush HaShem, the martyrology, when a government tells you you're not allowed to get together to pray for Yom Kippur? It happened in Jerusalem, happened in Israel this year. Israel is having a huge flare-up, and being a small country, that means pretty much everywhere is having a flare-up. But no more is having a flare-up than the Orthodox communities in Israel. Something like 40% of all new cases are taking place within this 20% of the Israeli population. And the government was forced to order lockdowns and severely curtail the number of people who could be in attendance in any location, and under what circumstances they could be, not just as a guideline, but as an actual penalty of enormous fines for people who were violating this. So, do you go or do you not go? Now, thankfully, we were able to manage the capacity within this room without coming to any risk. But there were many in Israel who chose, let's go ahead and take the risk, because this is akin to a despotic government telling us that we cannot practice Kiddush Hashem, that we cannot sanctify God's name. If I have to stay home because there's a cap on the number of people at my synagogue, and I am not allowed to go in because the government is forcing us not to, then I am being deprived of my Judaism. This is the government attempt to stamp out Jewish life. And therefore, I will walk straight in, and if the guard wants to shoot me, the guard will shoot me. Yes or no? I see a lot of shaking heads. Maybe you're saying no too, but I can't hear you through the mask. Which, watching you wear the mask and be separated from each other even without the relabeling of our pews, tells me that you're probably, yes, likely to get this answer right. So if you are unnecessarily risking not just your life, but other people's lives as well, not only does this qualify as what we call pikuach nefesh, which is one of the principles of Jewish law, which says the preservation of life is of paramount importance, you also violate the first half of chapter 22, verse 32, which says, do not desecrate my name. Chilul Hashem, in Jewish concept, is considered to apply to any action that is taken publicly in a way that brings shame upon God. That when you act in a way that is offensive, when you act in a way that is disgusting, when you act in a way that is jeopardizing pointlessly other lives, then you are actually desecrating God's name. You are not sanctifying it. No matter how righteous you may feel you are behaving, if what you are doing is bringing others into jeopardy, causing life to potentially be lost, and no one can doubt the seriousness of this potential at the moment, given the massive increases in cases in Israel and in ongoing struggle within our country and around the world, then you are not sanctifying God's name. You are not being a martyr. You are being a murderer. And sometimes it's hard to see the difference. Sometimes people are so caught up in believing that they are a victim, that they are willing to stand up for their rights, that they don't recognize that the right that they are trying to stand up for is actually the abrogation of someone else's safety and health. And that is not a right to stand up for. You are standing up for your right to put others at risk. This is not something that you have permission under Jewish law to impose upon someone else, because now you become the rodef, you become the one that is likely to cause harm to others. You are no longer the victim, you are now the attacker. And Judaism says, no, that's not the way it works. It's not an easy calculation to make. There are certain circumstances where, yes, we have to navigate different rules and different instances and try and make sure that we are balancing all of our concerns. But in the present day, especially within Israel under the present circumstances of its outbreak, it is pretty clear-cut which side Judaism asks us to be on and how it asks us to behave. And Judaism tells us that the highest priority is Kiddush HaShem, is to bring honor and greatness to God's name and to ensure that it is seen as being holy and inspiring to all. And this is something that we have to hold on to as well. When we are in this room, when we are broadcasting to people who are not here physically, when you walk out of this room and act as a Jew in the world, your actions must bring glory and honor to God's name. People must look at you and say, holy God, look at how that person's behaving. Wow. You know what? There might be something to this God business after all when I see how they're behaving. And at all times we have to push away the alternative. That when someone would look at our behavior, they would say, good, this is what religion is? This is what devotion to God looks like? No, thank you. On Sukkot, we undergo many hardships. Sitting in a sukkah, hopefully not too hard. The acquisition of a lulav and etrog, not exactly easy these days. The endurance fest of multiple services. All of these hopefully will strengthen you to be able to stand up for what is right and to recognize when you need to sit down and stay in place. Getting that calculation correct. This is the ultimate gift that our people have tried to give to us. And it is, like I said, not a simple thing. But in this particular case, the answers are pretty clear. Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach.